The blood-red sunrise set her trembling fingers on fire, as Delilah Thorne stumbled through the tall grasses of Indian Territory, her torn skirts gathering burrs and her lungs burning with each desperate breath. 3 days since the wagon train had left her behind. 3 days of wandering without direction, with only the knowledge that death awaited in this unforgiving wilderness. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her once pristine traveling dress now a tattered reminder of the civilized world she'd left behind. At 22, Delilah had never imagined herself abandoned in such a savage place, left to the mercy of elements and strangers alike. The memory of Edward Blackwell's sneering face as he'd ordered the wagons to continue without her still burned in her mind. Her refusal of his unwanted advances had sealed her fate. The sun climbed higher in the Oklahoma sky, its heat unrelenting as Delilah followed a shallow creek. Her water canteen, a parting gift from a sympathetic woman on the wagon train who hadn't dared defy Blackwell openly, was nearly empty. June 1876 was proving to be mercilessly hot, even for this territory. Delilah's thoughts drifted to her destination, Sonora, Texas, where her cousin had promised her a teaching position at the town school. Now that dream seemed as distant as the stars themselves. 100 miles away, Kane Kirkland shifted in his saddle, studying the ground with narrowed eyes. At 28, he'd earned a reputation as one of the finest trackers in the Texas Rangers, though he'd hung up that badge 2 years prior to run his family's ranch after his father's passing. The lean, broad-shouldered man adjusted his hat against the sun's glare and dismounted to examine the wagon tracks more closely. "What do you make of it, Kane?" asked Sheriff Miller, who had ridden out from Sonora to meet him at the territorial border. "Trains moving fast." "Too fast for comfort," Kane replied, his voice a low rumble that matched his thoughtful demeanor. "Something ain't right. See how the spacing changed here." He pointed to indentations in the dirt. They were traveling normal, then suddenly picked up pace. "And these footprints," his finger traced smaller imprints alongside the wagon tracks. "A woman, I'd wager. Walking alongside for a spell, then the wagon marks continue without her." Sheriff Miller sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "This matches what Miss Thorne's cousin reported. Said her letter indicated she'd be arriving with the Blackwell wagon train, but they rolled into town yesterday without her." When questioned, Blackwell claimed she chose to stay at a settlement back east. Kane's jaw tightened. "With tracks like these, I'd say that's horse manure. Looks to me like they left her behind." He stood, dusting off his hands on worn denim pants. "How long ago did they pass through?" 3 days, maybe 4. Kane nodded once decision made. "I'll find her." "The Rangers won't sanction an official search in Indian Territory. You know that," the sheriff warned. A ghost of a smile crossed Kane's weathered face. "Good thing I ain't a ranger anymore then." He mounted his chestnut stallion in one fluid motion. "Tell Aiden to watch over the ranch." "I'll be back when I find her." The sheriff shook his head. "You don't even know this woman, Kane." "Don't need to." Kane checked his provisions: jerky, hardtack, coffee, ammunition. No one deserves to be abandoned out there. As the sheriff rode back toward Sonora, Kane urged his horse northward, following the faint trail that veered away from the wagon tracks. The woman's footprints told a story: initially determined steps that gradually became uneven, suggesting exhaustion or injury. The thought of a lone woman wandering this territory made his blood boil. He'd seen too much death in his years as a ranger to harbor any illusions about her chances. "We'll find her, Thunder," he murmured to his horse, patting the animal's strong neck. "Just hope we're not too late." Delilah had lost track of time. 2 days. 3. The creek she'd been following had widened into a small river, providing water but little comfort. Her food a small bundle of jerky and biscuits she'd managed to grab before being forced from the wagon had run out that morning. The sound of horses in the distance sent her scrambling for cover beneath a stand of cottonwoods. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she peered through the undergrowth. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes unmistakably native. The Comanche had a fearsome reputation, and while she knew not all stories were true, her current vulnerability left no room for risk. The riders passed within 50 yards of her hiding place, close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on their leather garments. Only when they disappeared from view did she release her breath, unaware she'd been holding it. Night fell quickly in the territory, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that contradicted the day's heat. Delilah gathered what dry wood she could find, and using the matches she kept in a small tin in her pocket, kindled a small fire. The dancing flames provided comfort, but also made her visible for miles in the open prairie. She debated the wisdom of it, finally deciding that warmth outweighed caution. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by every snapping twig and animal call. When dawn painted the eastern sky with pale fingers of light, Delilah rose stiffly, her body protesting every movement. A glance at her reflection in the river showed a stranger hair matted with dirt, face streaked with grime, eyes hollowed by fear and fatigue. One foot in front of the other, she told herself, the words becoming a mantra as she continued her journey southward, guided only by the vague knowledge that Texas lay in that direction. By midday, her steps faltered. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and dizziness threatened to overtake her. When she spotted wild blackberries growing alongside the river, Delilah nearly wept with relief. She gathered them eagerly, juice staining her fingers purple as she ate handful after handful. The berries provided temporary strength, enough for her to continue until she spotted a promising shelter, a small bluff with an overhanging rock ledge that would provide protection for the night. As she settled beneath it, exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. Kane crossed into Indian territory with the rising sun at his back, alert to the dangers that surrounded him. This land belonged to various tribes: Comanche, Kiowa, Cherokee, and while treaties existed, tensions always simmered beneath the surface. As a former ranger, he developed a wary respect for the native peoples, understanding their resistance to the encroaching tide of white settlers. He followed the woman's trail with meticulous attention, noting where she'd stopped, where she'd gathered water, where her footsteps had faltered. By mid-afternoon, he discovered the remains of a small fire, the ashes still slightly warm. Not more than a day ahead, he murmured to himself, scanning the horizon. The terrain had changed, becoming rockier as the plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and cedar. Tracking would be harder here, but Kane had followed fainter trails in his time. Thunder's ears pricked forward suddenly, alerting Kane to movement ahead. He reined in, hand instinctively dropping to the Colt revolver at his hip. A group of 4 Comanche warriors appeared from behind a rocky outcropping, their mounts coming to a halt as they spotted him. Kane remained still, waiting. After a tense moment, one rider approached, stopping 10 yards away. "You cross Comanche land, white man," the warrior said in accented but clear English. Kane nodded respectfully. "I search for a woman. White woman left behind by wagon train. She is lost." The warrior's expression remained impassive. "We saw such a woman 2 suns ago by the river that flows to the south." Hope flared in Kane's chest. Was she alive? Well, she hid from us, but yes, she lived. The warrior pointed southeast. "She follows the river. This is dangerous for a woman alone." I know, that's why I'm tracking her. The Comanche studied him for a long moment. You are not with those who abandoned her. No, I come from Sonora in Texas. I'm bringing her to safety. Something like approval flickered across the warrior's face. Then ride fast, tracker. Others have seen her. Not all have good hearts. With that cryptic warning, he rejoined his companions, and the group continued westward. Kane didn't need to be told twice. He urged Thunder into a canter, following the river's course southeastward. If the Comanche had seen Delilah 2 days ago, and she was on foot, he could catch up to her by nightfall, assuming nothing had happened to her since. The thought spurred him to push harder, even as rational caution warned against recklessness. Getting himself injured wouldn't help the lost woman. Delilah woke to the sound of voices. Male voices, rough with drink and intent that made her blood run cold. Carefully, she peered from beneath her rocky shelter. 3 men, white men, dressed in the mismatched garb of drifters or outlaws, had set up camp less than 50 yards from her hiding place. Their horses were tethered nearby, and a bottle passed between them as they talked. Telling you, there's good money in it. Indians pay well for white women, especially pretty ones, one man was saying, his voice slurred. Risky business, another replied. Army don't take kindly to that sort of trade. Army ain't out here, the first countered. And that woman's tracks we've been following lead right along this river. She can't be far. Delilah's heart nearly stopped. They were tracking her. For what purpose? She could easily guess, and it filled her with terror. Slowly, she retreated deeper under the rock overhang, praying they wouldn't discover her. Night fell fully, and the men continued drinking around their fire. Delilah remained frozen in place, afraid that the slightest movement would betray her presence. Hours passed this way, her limbs cramping painfully, until finally the voices quieted as the men succumbed to drunken sleep. This was her chance. Moving with agonizing slowness, Delilah crept from her shelter, staying low to the ground. The men's horses nickered softly as she passed, but didn't raise alarm. Once she'd put several hundred yards between herself and the camp, Delilah broke into a run, abandoning the riverside path she'd been following in favor of deeper cover among the trees and hills. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give way, finally collapsing behind a large boulder. Fear gave her no rest, however, and after only minutes, she forced herself to continue, moving as quietly as possible through the night-shrouded landscape. Dawn found her miles from the river, hopelessly lost but driven by the terror of what awaited if she were caught. Thirst soon became an urgent concern, with no water source in sight. By midday, Delilah's lips had cracked and her throat felt like sandpaper. The sun beat down mercilessly, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. When she stumbled upon a small spring bubbling from between rocks, Delilah fell to her knees, cupping water to her parched mouth with trembling hands. The liquid was life itself, reviving her enough to take stock of her situation. She had no food, no idea where she was, and men hunting her with vile intent. Her dress hung in tatters, offering little protection from sun or thorny undergrowth. Despair threatened to overwhelm her, but Delilah refused to surrender to it. "I will not die here," she declared to the empty wilderness. "I will not." Kane lost the trail where it left the river, cursing under his breath as he circled back, searching for signs. When he found footprints again, smaller than before, a woman running, his concern deepened. What had spooked her enough to abandon the water source? The answer came an hour later when he encountered a recently abandoned campsite. 3 sets of men's boots had left distinct impressions, along with empty whiskey bottles and the remains of a rabbit they'd cooked. Kane's experienced eye read the scene like a book. Drifters, possibly outlaws, definitely dangerous, and they appeared to be tracking the same woman he sought. Kane checked his Winchester repeater and his Colt, ensuring both were loaded and ready. If these men meant the woman harm, they'd find more trouble than they bargained for. He followed both trails now, the woman's desperate flight and the men's more deliberate pursuit. By mid-afternoon, he'd closed the distance considerably, spotting the three riders in a valley below his elevated position. They were moving slowly, obviously tracking, occasionally dismounting to examine the ground. Kane hung back, observing. These weren't random travelers. They were hunting with purpose. The way they checked their weapons periodically told him all he needed to know about their intentions. A plan formed in his mind. Rather than confronting them directly, he would circle around, find the woman first if possible, and lead her to safety. With Thunder's speed and his knowledge of the territory, they could outpace these pursuers once they reached more familiar ground. Keeping to higher elevations where he could observe without being seen, Kane continued his search, driven by an urgency that grew with each passing hour. Delilah had found a small grove of plum trees, their fruit not quite ripe but edible enough to quiet her stomach's painful protests. She gathered as many as she could carry in her torn apron, then continued southward, guided by the sun's position. The land had become increasingly hilly, offering better hiding places but making travel more difficult. Her boots, not designed for such terrain, had begun to fall apart, and blisters formed on her heels and toes. Still, she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant certain capture. As twilight approached, Delilah spotted a thin column of smoke rising from beyond the next ridge. A campfire, but whose friend or foe? After her encounter with the drifters, she dared not assume safety anywhere, yet the possibility of help was too tempting to ignore completely. Cautiously, she crept toward the ridge, staying low and using whatever cover the landscape provided. When she reached the top, she peered down into a small clearing where a solitary figure tended a modest fire. The man was native Cherokee, by the look of his clothing and the distinctive pattern of his blanket. An elderly man, his face deeply lined, he moved with the deliberate grace of one who had seen many seasons. Near him grazed a spotted pony, and a small shelter of branches and hides stood nearby. Delilah hesitated. The stories she'd heard of Indian savagery warred with her desperate need for help. As she watched, the old man looked up suddenly, staring directly at her hiding place with uncanny accuracy. "I see you there, young one," he called out in clear, if accented English. "You need not hide, I offer no harm." Startled, Delilah remained frozen in place, unsure whether to flee or respond. "You run from something," the old man continued, "or someone. The night comes quickly, and these hills are no place for one alone. I have food to share." Hunger and exhaustion finally overcame caution. Slowly, Delilah rose and made her way down the slope toward the campfire. "I am called Gray Hawk," the old man said when she approached. "Sit, rest." "Delilah," she replied, her voice rough from disuse and thirst. "Delilah Thorne." Gray Hawk nodded, then handed her a water skin and a strip of dried meat. "Eat slowly. Your stomach will reject too much too quickly." Delilah accepted both gratefully, following his advice, though her body screamed for her to devour the food. As she ate, Gray Hawk studied her with keen dark eyes. "You were with the wagon train," he stated rather than asked. "The one that passed 4 days ago." "Yes," Delilah confirmed, surprised. "How did you know?" Gray Hawk made a dismissive gesture. "The land speaks to those who listen, and others have spoken of a white woman walking alone where no woman should walk alone." "They left me behind," Delilah said, the words bringing a fresh wave of anger and hurt. Because I refused a man's advances." Gray Hawk's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. The white man's justice is strange, to leave one of their own to die for such a reason. Not all would do such a thing, Delilah felt compelled to say, though she'd had precious little evidence of humanity's better nature in recent days. Perhaps. Gray Hawk added wood to the fire. You head south, to Texas, a town called Sonora where my cousin lives. The old man nodded. A long journey still, but possible. I will show you a safer path when morning comes. Relief washed over Delilah. Thank you, I don't know how to repay such kindness. Live, Gray Hawk said simply. That is payment enough. As night settled fully around them, Delilah found herself relaxing for the first time in days. Under Gray Hawk's shelter, wrapped in a spare blanket he provided, she slept deeply and without dreams. Kane lost the trail as darkness fell, forcing him to make camp for the night. Frustration gnawed at him. Every hour increased the danger to the woman he sought. The three men tracking her had also stopped for the night, their campfire visible in the distance, but Kane knew they would resume the hunt at first light. He allowed himself only a few hours of rest, rising well before dawn to continue his search. The first fingers of light revealed fresh tracks, not the woman's, but the three men's. They had resumed their pursuit with disturbing eagerness. Kane mounted Thunder and followed at a steady pace, alert to any sign of the woman's trail intersecting with theirs. By mid-morning, the tracks led him to a ridge overlooking a small valley. Below, a thin stream wound through scattered trees, and beside it stood a small encampment, a Cherokee dwelling by the look of it. Through his field glass, Kane could see an elderly native man moving about the camp, but no sign of a white woman. Had she passed this way? The three trackers' trail continued around the valley rather than into it, suggesting they hadn't spotted the camp yet. Decision made, Kane guided Thunder down the slope toward the encampment. If the Cherokee man had seen the woman, he might provide information. And if not, Kane would warn him about the three armed men in the vicinity. The old man was waiting for him, standing calmly beside the remnants of a cooking fire as Kane approached. The tracker reined in a respectful distance away and raised his hand in greeting. "Peace, friend," Kane called. "I mean no harm." The elderly man nodded once. "Few who mean harm announce it so directly," he replied in good English. "What brings a lone rider to my fire?" Kane dismounted, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I search for a woman, white woman left behind by a wagon train. She would have passed this way within the last few days." Interest flickered in the old man's eyes. "And why do you seek this woman when her own people abandoned her?" "To bring her to safety," Kane said simply. "She has family waiting in Sonora who are concerned for her." The old man considered this, then asked, "And the others who track her, what is their purpose?" Kane's expression hardened. "Nothing good. 3 men following her trail. I've been tracking them as well." "I see." The old man was silent for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "I am called Gray Hawk. The woman you seek was here. She left at dawn, following the stream southward. I showed her a path that would lead eventually to your Texas lands." Relief flooded through Kane. "She's alive then? Well, tired, hungry, afraid, but strong in spirit." Gray Hawk pointed toward a barely visible trail that followed the stream. "She has perhaps 2 hours lead on you. And the others, they pass to the east, missing this valley, but they will find her trail again soon enough." Kane nodded grimly. "I thank you for your help." "I'll find her before they do." Gray Hawk studied him intently. "You were a soldier. No, something else. A ranger, perhaps." "Once," Kane acknowledged, surprised at the old man's perception. "Good. She will need a warrior's protection." Gray Hawk gestured to the stream. "Water your horse, then ride." The woman called Delilah has courage, but courage alone will not save her from 3 wolves. Kane's determination redoubled at hearing her name Delilah. No longer just the woman, but a person with identity and life. He quickly refilled his canteen and allowed Thunder to drink from the stream. Before departing, he offered Gray Hawk some of his provisions as thanks, but the old man declined with a slight smile. "Find her," was all he said as Kane mounted up. "The land has not decided her fate yet." With a respectful nod, Kane urged Thunder onto the trail southward, hope renewing his energy. Delilah was alive, and by Gray Hawk's reckoning not far ahead. If he pushed hard, he could reach her before the 3 pursuers realigned with her trail. What he would do then, he wasn't entirely sure. Getting her safely to Texas was the priority, but 3 armed men presented a significant obstacle. Kane had faced worse odds as a ranger, but he'd had a badge and the law behind him then. Now, he was just one man with a moral compass that wouldn't allow him to abandon someone in need. The sound of flowing water had been Delilah's constant companion since leaving Gray Hawk's camp. The stream led southward as promised, its course cutting through increasingly rugged terrain. The old Cherokee had provided her with a small bundle of provisions, dried meat, a handful of parched corn, and a water-skin precious gifts that had renewed her strength and resolve. His parting words echoed in her mind. "The path is not always clear, but water always seeks its way home. Follow the stream and trust your heart when the time comes to choose." Cryptic advice, but Delilah clung to it nonetheless. After days of wandering, lost and afraid, even the vaguest direction felt like a lifeline. The sun climbed higher, its heat tempered somewhat by the tree cover that flanked the stream. Delilah paused to rest, dipping her swollen feet in the cool water and allowing herself a small portion of the dried meat. According to Gray Hawk, if she maintained her pace, she would reach the border of Texas in 3 to 4 days. The thought gave her courage. 3 to 4 days of vigilance and hardship, then salvation. A snapping twig behind her shattered the moment's peace. Delilah whirled, heart pounding, to find herself facing one of the men she'd seen at the riverside camp. Bearded and filthy, he grinned with tobacco-stained teeth, a knife held casually in one hand. "Well now, ain't you a pretty little rabbit?" he drawled, taking a step closer. "Been tracking you for days, missy. You led us on quite a chase." Delilah backed away, glancing desperately for an escape route. "Stay back," she warned, voice steadier than she felt. "I have nothing you want." The man chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "That ain't true at all. Got plenty a man might want." He gestured with the knife. "Calloway, Finch, over here, found our prize." Terror surged through Delilah. She turned to run, but the man lunged forward with surprising speed, grabbing her arm in a bruising grip. She fought wildly, kicking and clawing as he attempted to subdue her. "Feisty one," he grunted, trying to pin her arms. "Settle down now," or the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the struggle. Both Delilah and her attacker froze, turning toward the source of the sound. A man sat astride a chestnut horse 20 yards away, a Winchester repeater aimed steadily at the bearded assailant. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed features partially shadowed by his hat, the newcomer radiated lethal capability. "Let the lady go," he said, his voice deep and even. "Right now." The bearded man hesitated, knife still in hand. "This ain't your business, mister. I'm making it my business." The rider's aim didn't waver. "Your friends are going to want to come out in the open too, nice and slow." After a tense moment, 2 more men emerged from the brush, hands slightly raised. They flanked Delilah's captor, their expressions calculating rather than fearful. 3 against 1, friend," said the taller of the newcomers, whom Delilah assumed was either Calloway or Finch. Might want to reconsider your position." The rider shifted the rifle slightly. "I count 15 rounds between my Winchester and my Colt, more than enough for all of you with plenty to spare." His steady gaze returned to the man holding Delilah. "Last chance. Let her go and ride out." Something in his tone, absolute certainty, perhaps must have convinced the bearded man. He released Delilah's arm, shoving her roughly away as he stepped back. "Ain't worth dying over," he muttered to his companions. "Plenty other opportunities in these territories." "Wise decision," the rider said. "Now drop your weapons and back away. You'll find your horses where you left them. I suggest you use them to put miles between us before I change my mind." The 3 men complied reluctantly, dropping knives and pistols to the ground before retreating toward their mounts tethered some distance away. Only when they'd mounted up and ridden off did the newcomer lower his rifle, his attention turning fully to Delilah. "Miss Thorne?" he asked, dismounting with fluid grace. Delilah stared, shock and relief warring within her. You know me, Kane Kirkland, madam." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair and eyes that assessed her condition with concern. "Your cousin in Sonora sent me looking when you didn't arrive with the wagon train." "My cousin?" Tears sprang to Delilah's eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since her abandonment. "Emmeline sent you," Kane nodded. "She was mighty worried when Blackwell's train arrived without you." His jaw tightened. "Said Blackwell claimed you'd chosen to stay behind in a settlement, but she didn't believe it for a minute." "He lied," Delilah said bitterly. "He left me behind because I refused his attentions, just abandoned me in the middle of nowhere." Something dangerous flashed in Kane's eyes. "That squares with what the tracks told me." He approached slowly as one might a skittish colt. "Are you hurt, Miss Thorne?" Delilah took stock of herself, exhausted, dirty, feet blistered and raw but alive. "Nothing serious, nothing that won't heal." Kane's expression softened slightly. "You're a brave woman, Miss Thorne. Most wouldn't have survived this long alone." The simple acknowledgement of what she'd endured broke something inside Delilah. A sob escaped her throat, followed by another. Before she knew what was happening, she was crying in earnest, days of terror and loneliness pouring out of her in unstoppable waves. Strong hands gently guided her to sit on a fallen log. Kane didn't speak, merely offered a clean bandana and the solid presence of someone who understood the need to release such emotions. When the storm finally passed, Delilah wiped her face, embarrassment replacing catharsis. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I don't usually. No apologies needed," Kane interrupted gently. "You've earned those tears and then some." Gratitude washed over her. This man, this stranger who'd ridden into Indian territory to find her understood without judgment. It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had done for her since her parents' deaths 2 years prior. "Thank you," she said simply, "for coming to find me, for saving me from those men." Kane nodded once, then set about making a small camp. "Rest a bit, Miss Thorne. We've got a long ride ahead to reach Sonora, and you'll need your strength." As he efficiently gathered wood for a fire, Delilah found herself studying him with growing curiosity. Kane Kirkland moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to wilderness and danger. Yet there was a gentleness to his actions that belied his formidable appearance. He was handsome in a rugged way, with features sculpted by sun and wind rather than aristocratic breeding. "Mr. Kirkland," she ventured as he kindled a small fire, "were you truly sent by my cousin? Or were you being polite about tracking me because of other reasons?" Kane looked up, a hint of amusement touching his eyes. "Sheriff Miller came to me when Miss Emmeline raised concerns. I've some experience tracking, and I know this territory better than most." He paused. "And I've no patience for men who'd leave a woman to die out of spite." His directness was refreshing after the honeyed lies of men like Blackwell. Delilah found herself warming to Kane Kirkland in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude for her rescue. "You said you have tracking experience. Were you a scout? A hunter?" A shadow crossed his face. "Texas Ranger for 7 years. Gave it up 2 years back when my father passed, to run the family ranch." "I see." Delilah processed this information. Rangers were legendary throughout the West, brave men who often operated alone against terrible odds. "Your ranch, is it near Sonora? Just outside it?" Kirkland's spread runs along the western edge of town. Kane handed her a cup of coffee he'd brewed, strong and aromatic. "Your cousin teaches at the schoolhouse there. Well-respected lady." Delilah sipped the bitter liquid gratefully. "Emmeline is the only family I have left." When she wrote offering a position at her school, it seemed providential. "What were you before?" Kane asked, settling across the fire from her. "If you don't mind my asking." "A teacher in Missouri, but after my parents died of the fever, there was nothing to keep me there." Delilah's fingers tightened around the tin cup. "I used nearly everything I had to secure passage with Blackwell's train." Kane's expression darkened. "Blackwell will answer for what he did. Abandonment in these territories is tantamount to murder." "I don't know that the law would see it that way," Delilah said wearily. "It would be his word against mine." "Maybe," Kane allowed. "But Sonora's a small town with a long memory. Blackwell won't find business easy there once word spreads." They lapsed into comfortable silence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Kane prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork that tasted like a feast to Delilah's deprived palate. As they ate, he outlined his plan for their return journey. "We'll rest here tonight. At first light, we'll head south, keeping to higher ground where possible. 3 days' ride should see us crossing into Texas, and another day to Sonora if all goes well." "Those men, will they come back?" Delilah couldn't help asking, the fear still fresh. Kane shook his head. "Not likely. Men like that are cowards at heart. They prey on the vulnerable, not on armed opposition." His hand rested casually on his holstered Colt. "And if they're foolish enough to try, they'll regret it." The quiet confidence in his voice reassured Delilah more than any boastful promises might have. Kane Kirkland was clearly a man who measured his words carefully and meant what he said. As darkness settled around their small camp, Kane arranged his bedroll for Delilah and prepared to take watch for the night. "You should sleep," Delilah protested. "You've been tracking for days." "I'll rest," he promised. "But someone needs to keep watch, at least until we're well clear of Indian territory." Delilah wanted to argue further but found her eyelids growing heavy despite her intentions. The bedroll, though simple, felt like unimaginable luxury after nights spent on hard ground with nothing but her torn skirts for comfort. "Sleep, Miss Thorne," Kane said softly. "You're safe now." As she drifted towards slumber, Delilah realized it was true. For the first time in days, she felt genuinely safe, protected by this quiet, capable man who'd ridden into dangerous territory to find a woman he'd never met. Her last conscious thought was a prayer of thanks for Kane Kirkland's appearance in her hour of need. Dawn broke with a chorus of birdsong and the aromatic scent of coffee brewing. Delilah opened her eyes to find Kane already awake, tending the small fire and preparing for the day's journey. He acknowledged her with a nod and a brief smile that transformed his serious features. "Sleep well?" he inquired, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. "Better than I have in days," Delilah admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Did you rest at all, Mr. Kirkland?" "Kane," he corrected gently. "And yes, I caught a few hours. Enough." After a breakfast of hardtack and dried beef, Kane saddled Thunder while Delilah gathered their few belongings. When the time came to mount, Delilah hesitated, eyeing the large stallion with trepidation. "I haven't ridden much," she confessed. "Certainly not a horse this size." Kane's expression softened. "Thunder's gentle despite his appearance, but we'll take it slow until you're comfortable." He helped her mount first, then swung up behind her in one fluid motion. Delilah tensed initially at the unfamiliar proximity, but soon relaxed as Kane guided the horse with skilled hands, keeping their pace steady and smooth. They traveled southward through rolling hills and scattered woodlands, Kane pointing out landmarks and signs of wildlife as they rode. His deep voice rumbled against Delilah's back as he shared stories of the territory which tribes claimed, which lands, the best places to find water, the meaning behind distinctive rock formations they passed. "How did you learn all this?" Delilah asked, genuinely curious. "It seems like you know every inch of this wilderness." Kane was quiet for a moment before answering. "My mother was half Cherokee. She taught me to read the land before I could read books." There was a note of reverence in his voice. Said a man who couldn't converse with the wilderness would always be a stranger to himself. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. The simple past tense spoke volumes. "Passed when I was 14. Fever took her, same as your parents." Delilah's heart ached for the boy he must have been. "I'm sorry." Kane acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod she felt rather than saw. "It was long ago, but her teaching stayed with me, served me well as a ranger and serve me still." By midday, they stopped near a small creek to rest and water Thunder. Delilah stretched her aching muscles, unaccustomed to long hours in the saddle. Kane watched her with concern. "We can make camp early if you need more rest," he offered. Delilah shook her head determinedly. "I'm fine. The sooner we reach Texas, the better." A ghost of a smile touched Kane's lips. "Stubborn," he observed, but the word held admiration rather than criticism. As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant sound caught Kane's attention. He went still, head cocked slightly as he listened. "Riders," he said after a moment, voice dropping. "At least 4, maybe 5. Coming this way." Delilah's heart raced. "The men from before?" "Can't tell yet." Kane quickly gathered their belongings. "Mount up. We need to find cover until I know who we're dealing with." He helped her onto Thunder with urgent efficiency, then led the horse into a densely wooded area nearby. From this vantage point, partially concealed by foliage, they could observe the approaching riders without being immediately visible. 5 men appeared on the horizon, moving at a steady trot. They wore no uniforms, but something about their organized formation suggested military training. Kane's posture relaxed slightly as he studied them. "Army scouts," he murmured. "Probably patrolling for hostiles or renegades." "Is that good or bad for us?" Delilah whispered. Kane considered. "Could be helpful. They might escort us to the territorial border." He glanced at her. "Your choice, Miss Thorne. We can make ourselves known or continue on our own." Delilah hesitated. The prospect of additional protection was tempting, but something in Kane's expression suggested he preferred self-reliance. "What would you do?" she asked finally. "Avoid them," Kane answered without hesitation. "Army patrols have their own priorities. They might take us miles out of our way or detain us for questioning about what we've seen in the territory." "Then we continue alone," Delilah decided, trusting his judgment. Kane nodded approvingly. They remained hidden until the patrol passed, then resumed their journey, altering their course slightly to avoid crossing the soldiers' path again. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Thunder navigated the rocky slopes with sure-footed determination, but their progress slowed. Kane finally called a halt in a protected hollow where a spring bubbled from between stones. "We'll camp here," he announced, dismounting and helping Delilah down. "Good water," defensible position. While Kane cared for Thunder and gathered firewood, Delilah set about organizing their meager provisions for the evening meal. The domesticity of the task felt strangely comforting after days of desperate survival. "How much farther to Texas?" she asked, as Kane returned with an armload of wood. "If we maintain our pace, we'll cross the border late tomorrow," he replied, arranging the wood for a fire. Another day after that to Sonora. 2 more days of travel. 2 more days in the company of this quiet, capable man who'd already risked his life to save hers. The thought brought a confusing mixture of relief and something else. Something Delilah wasn't quite ready to examine. As darkness fell, they sat before the small fire, sharing the last of Kane's coffee. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds on black cloth. Kane pointed out constellations, teaching her their Cherokee names alongside the ones she knew from astronomy books. "That one," he said, indicating a bright star low on the horizon, "my mother called the traveler's guide. Said if you're lost, it will lead you home. And has it led you home?" Kane's gaze shifted from the star to her face, something unreadable in his expression. "It has yet to fail me." The quiet intensity of his voice sent a shiver through Delilah that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. For a brief moment, neither spoke, the silence between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Kane broke the spell first, rising to bank the fire for the night. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." Delilah nodded, retreating to the bedroll he'd again insisted she use. As she settled beneath the blanket, she watched Kane prepare for his night watch, his movements economical and precise. "Kane," she said softly. When he turned, she continued, "Thank you, not just for the rescue, but for everything, your kindness." In the fading firelight, his expression softened. "Get some sleep, Delilah." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice followed her into dreams that were, for once, peaceful rather than haunted. Morning arrived with a light mist that shrouded the landscape in ethereal beauty. They broke camp efficiently, falling into a rhythm established the previous day. As they rode, Delilah found herself increasingly comfortable with Kane's proximity, the initial awkwardness giving way to a sense of rightness that both comforted and unsettled her. The day passed without incident, their path taking them through increasingly fertile land as they approached the Texas border. By late afternoon, Kane pointed to a distant ridge. "Beyond that lies Texas," he said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "We'll make camp on the other side in familiar territory." Relief washed over Delilah. Soon, she would be safe in Sonora, reunited with Emmeline, beginning the new life she'd journeyed so far to find. Yet mixed with that relief was a strange reluctance once they reached civilization. Her time with Kane would end. The thought brought an unexpected pang of loss. They crested the ridge as the sun began its descent, painting the landscape in gold and amber hues. Before them stretched rolling Texas plains, so different from the rugged territory they'd left behind. Kane halted Thunder, allowing them both to absorb the moment. "Welcome to Texas, Miss Thorne," he said quietly. Delilah blinked back sudden tears. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see it," she admitted. "When they left me behind, I thought," her voice faltered. Kane's arm tightened slightly around her waist, a gesture of comfort and understanding. "But you did. You survived. Most wouldn't have." His praise warmed her more than it should have. "Only because you found me." "I merely arrived for the final chapter," Kane countered. "You wrote most of the story yourself, with courage and determination." They made camp that night in a small grove of live oaks, the Texas soil beneath them feeling like a promise kept. Kane was more relaxed here, in his own territory. though his vigilance never completely disappeared. As they shared a meal enhanced by fresh game Kane had shot during their descent from the ridge, Delilah gathered courage to ask a question that had been forming in her mind. "What happens when we reach Sonora? To Blackwell, I mean." Kane considered this, his expression hardening. "That depends on Sheriff Miller and on you. If you wish to press charges for abandonment and endangerment, I'll stand witness. And if the law does nothing—" A dangerous glint appeared in Kane's eyes. "Then other forms of justice might prevail. Sonora protects its own." "I'm not its own yet," Delilah pointed out. "You will be." The certainty in Kane's voice stirred something within her. "Sonora's small, but it's a good community. Once folks hear what happened, you'll find no shortage of support." The thought was comforting. After years of feeling adrift following her parents' deaths, the prospect of belonging somewhere to a community that valued justice and compassion appealed deeply to Delilah. "Tell me about your ranch," she requested, eager to learn more about Kane's life beyond his role as her rescuer. Kane's features softened as he spoke of the Kirkland spread 3,000 acres of good grazing land, a modest herd of quality cattle, the house his grandfather had built and his father had expanded. Pride tinged his voice when he mentioned the local reputation of Kirkland beef and the loyal hands who worked his land. "It sounds wonderful," Delilah said sincerely. "You must love it very much." "I do," Kane acknowledged, "though it gets lonely at times. My father always said a ranch needs a family to make it truly thrive." Something in his tone made Delilah glance away, her cheeks warming. To cover her reaction, she asked, "And the town? What's Sonora like?" Kane described a thriving community centered around cattle, ranching, and trade, with a church, a school, several stores, and even a small theater for traveling shows. As he painted a picture of the place that would soon be her home, Delilah found herself increasingly eager to arrive. "Your cousin's been campaigning for a proper library," Kane added with a slight smile. "Convinced half the town council already. Determined lady, Miss Emmeline." "She always was," Delilah agreed fondly. Even as a girl, once she set her mind to something, there was no dissuading her. "Seems to run in the family," Kane observed, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Delilah looked away first, suddenly conscious of how intimate their fireside conversation had become. "I should rest," she said, rising. "If tomorrow brings us to Sonora, I want to be presentable." Kane nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Sleep well, Delilah." As she settled into the now familiar bedroll, Delilah found her thoughts in turmoil. In just a few days, Kane Kirkland had transformed from stranger to rescuer to what? Friend seemed inadequate for the connection that had formed between them. Yet anything more was surely impossible. They barely knew each other, and her life in Sonora would take her in different directions once they arrived. Still, as sleep claimed her, Delilah couldn't help wondering what might have been under different circumstances if they had met in town, perhaps, rather than in the midst of danger and desperation. Their final day of travel dawned bright and clear, the Texas landscape stretching before them in rolling waves of green and gold. Kane's mood was lighter, his occasional comments revealing a dry wit that had been largely absent during their more perilous journey through Indian territory. By midday, signs of civilization appeared: fenced pastures, the occasional distant farmhouse, well-traveled roads replacing wilderness trails. Delilah felt both excitement and apprehension growing as they approached Sonora. Soon, very soon, this extraordinary interlude would end, and normal life would resume. "There," Kane said eventually, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley ahead. Sonora. The town was larger than Delilah had imagined, with a proper main street lined with businesses, a white steepled church rising prominently at one end, and neat houses spreading outward from the center. As they rode closer, details emerged: a busy general store with wagons outside, children playing in a schoolyard, women in conversation on a boardwalk, civilization, safety. The destination Delilah had feared she might never reach. Their appearance created an immediate stir. A woman in a calico dress stopped in her tracks, staring openly before hurrying toward the sheriff's office. A blacksmith paused in his work, hammer suspended in mid-air as he watched them pass. Children pointed and whispered behind their hands. "Word travels fast," Kane murmured, guiding Thunder down the main street. "Sheriff Miller's office is just ahead." "Everyone's staring," Delilah whispered back, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance after days in the wilderness. "They're just curious," Kane assured her. "And likely relieved. Your cousin's been beside herself with worry." As if summoned by his words, a woman emerged from a building ahead, her hand flying to her mouth as she spotted them. Tall and slender, with Delilah's same auburn hair, Emmeline Thorne rushed forward as Kane brought Thunder to a halt. "Delilah! Oh, thank God!" Tears streamed down Emmeline's face as Kane helped Delilah dismount. The cousins embraced fiercely, both weeping now. "When that horrible man Blackwell said you'd stayed behind, I just knew something was wrong." "Emmeline," Delilah managed through her tears, "I'm all right. I'm here." Over her cousin's shoulder, Delilah caught Kane's eye. He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both congratulation and farewell, then turned Thunder toward the sheriff's office nearby. "Wait," Delilah called, reluctantly breaking from Emmeline's embrace. "Kane," he paused, looking back with an unreadable expression. "I thank you." The words seemed woefully inadequate. "I owe you my life." A small crowd had gathered now, watching the reunion with undisguised interest. Among them, Sheriff Miller emerged from his office, expression shifting from concern to relief at the sight of Delilah. "No debt between us, Miss Thorne," Kane replied formally, aware of their audience. "I'm glad to see you safe home." With a final nod to both women, he continued toward the sheriff. Emmeline slipped an arm around Delilah's waist, supporting her obviously exhausted cousin. "Come, dear. My house is just down the street. You need rest, food, clean clothes." She glanced after Kane's retreating figure. "And then you'll tell me everything." "Everything," Delilah agreed, allowing herself to be led away. But as they walked, she couldn't help looking back one last time at the man who'd tracked her across dangerous territory and brought her safely home. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of recovery and integration into Sonora society. Emmeline's cozy home became a sanctuary where Delilah could regain her strength and begin processing all that had happened. Word of her ordeal spread quickly through town, earning her both sympathy and admiration for her survival. Sheriff Miller took her formal statement about Blackwell's actions, his weathered face grim as she recounted the abandonment. "Man's guilty of criminal endangerment at the very least," he declared when she'd finished. "He'll face charges next time he sets foot in this county." "Will that be enough?" Delilah asked, remembering Kane's words about other forms of justice. The sheriff exchanged a glance with Emmeline. "Let's just say Mr. Blackwell will find his wagons unwelcome in these parts from now on. Word travels among settlements. His business will suffer accordingly." The community embraced Delilah with unexpected warmth. Ladies from the church brought food and offers of friendship. The mayor's wife personally invited her to a social gathering. The school board officially confirmed her teaching position for the fall term, with many parents expressing enthusiasm for their children to learn from someone of such proven character and resilience. As the chairman put it, through it all, Delilah found her thoughts repeatedly returning to Kane. He hadn't called at Emmeline's house, nor had their paths crossed in town, though Sonora wasn't large enough for complete avoidance to be accidental. The only news she had of him came through Emmeline, who reported that he'd returned to his ranch immediately after speaking with the sheriff. "He's always been something of a solitary figure," Emmeline explained over tea one afternoon, a week after Delilah's arrival. "Respected, certainly, but private. His ranch keeps him busy." "I see," Delilah replied, trying to hide her disappointment. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that their connection might extend beyond the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting. Emmeline studied her cousin shrewdly. "He made quite an impression on you." Delilah flushed. "He saved my life." "Yes, he did." Emmeline's tone suggested she understood more than Delilah was admitting. "The Founders' Day celebration is this Saturday. The whole town attends, including the ranchers from outlying properties." She smiled innocently. "I've already promised to help with the refreshment table." "You'll come, of course." Delilah recognized the transparent matchmaking attempt, but couldn't bring herself to object. The prospect of seeing Kane again sent her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude for her rescue. Saturday dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for an outdoor celebration. The town square had been transformed with bunting, tables laden with food, and a wooden platform for dancing. By mid-morning, it seemed all of Sonora had gathered, from elderly pioneers who remembered the town's founding to infants experiencing their first community event. Delilah, wearing a new blue dress that Emmeline had insisted on purchasing for the occasion, helped arrange pies and cakes on the refreshment table while scanning the growing crowd for a familiar tall figure. Disappointment settled in her stomach as the morning progressed with no sign of Kane. "He'll come," Emmeline murmured, correctly interpreting her cousin's frequent glances toward the square's entrance. "Kane Kirkland has never missed a Founder's Day in all the years I've lived here." True to Emmeline's prediction, Kane appeared shortly after noon, riding Thunder into town and dismounting at the hitching post near the square. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance clean-shaven, wearing a fresh shirt and his best denims, his dark hair neatly combed beneath his hat. Delilah's heart performed a complicated maneuver in her chest as he scanned the crowd, his gaze eventually finding her across the square. For a moment, neither moved, the connection between them palpable even at a distance. Then Kane nodded slightly and began making his way toward her, pausing occasionally to exchange greetings with townspeople who clearly held him in high regard. "Miss Thorne," he said formally when he reached her, removing his hat. "You're looking well. Mr. Kirkland." Delilah cursed the sudden breathlessness in her voice. "It's good to see you." An awkward silence fell between them, the easy companionship of their journey seemingly replaced by uncertainty. Emmeline, after one glance at their expressions, tactfully excused herself to attend to something across the square. "How are you finding Sonora?" Kane asked finally, replacing his hat. "Welcoming," Delilah replied honestly. "Everyone has been very kind. I'm glad." Kane's gaze lingered on her face. "The town needed a good teacher. Folks are looking forward to the fall term. As am I." Delilah hesitated, then added more softly, "I've hoped to see you to thank you properly for what you did." Something flickered in Kane's eyes, warmth perhaps, or regret. "No thanks necessary. I did what anyone would do." "We both know that's not true," Delilah countered gently. "Most men wouldn't have risked Indian territory to find a stranger." Before Kane could respond, a commotion at the square's entrance drew their attention. A group of riders had appeared, dusty from travel and leading several pack horses. At their head was a heavily bearded man Delilah recognized with a jolt of fear: Edward Blackwell. "What's he doing here?" she whispered, instinctively stepping closer to Kane. Kane's expression hardened as he watched Blackwell dismount and swagger toward the refreshment tables, apparently oblivious to the suddenly cooler atmosphere among the townspeople. "Looking for trouble, I'd wager." Sheriff Miller intercepted Blackwell before he'd gone far, their conversation too distant to overhear but clearly tense from the body language. Several of Sonora's leading citizens drifted toward the confrontation, forming a subtle but unmistakable barrier between Blackwell and the celebration. "Perhaps I should leave," Delilah suggested, uncomfortable with the prospect of a public scene. "I don't want to ruin the festivities." "Stay." Kane's hand closed gently around her arm. "You've nothing to be ashamed of, he does." As they watched, Sheriff Miller appeared to deliver some unwelcome news to Blackwell, whose face flushed with anger visible even across the distance. The wagon master looked around wildly, his gaze finally landing on Delilah. Recognition and fury darkened his features, and he started forward, only to be firmly restrained by the sheriff and several other men. Delilah braced herself, but Kane stepped slightly in front of her, his stance protective without being possessive. Blackwell, seeing this, seemed to reconsider his approach. After an angry exchange with the sheriff, he returned to his horse, mounted up with poor grace, and led his men back out of town, casting one venomous glance over his shoulder as he departed. A collective breath seemed to release from the gathered townspeople. Sheriff Miller approached Delilah and Kane, his expression apologetic. "Sorry about that, Miss Thorne. Didn't expect him back so soon, or I'd have warned you." "What did you tell him?" Delilah asked. The sheriff's weathered face creased in a grim smile. "That he's been charged with criminal endangerment and abandonment, that no business in Sonora will trade with him, and that if he approaches you, he'll find himself in my jail awaiting a judge." He glanced at Kane. "Also mentioned that certain parties might take personal exception to any trouble he causes." Kane's expression remained impassive, but something dangerous lurked beneath the surface. "He made the right choice leaving. Indeed he did." Sheriff Miller tipped his hat to Delilah. "Enjoy the celebration, Miss Thorne. I don't expect we'll see Blackwell in these parts again." As the sheriff moved away, the festive atmosphere gradually returned to the square. The band struck up a lively tune, and couples began forming for dancing on the wooden platform. "Would you care to dance, Miss Thorne?" Kane asked suddenly, the formality of his words belied by the warmth in his eyes. Delilah smiled, relief and something deeper washing through her. "I would like that very much, Mr. Kirkland." Kane led her to the platform with a gentleness that contrasted with his imposing presence. As they joined the other dancers, Delilah felt the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. Here, surrounded by her new community, with Kane's strong hands guiding her through the steps, she could begin to envision a future beyond mere survival. They danced 3 sets before retreating to the shade of a large oak tree at the square's edge. Conversation flowed more easily between them now, the awkwardness of their initial reunion replaced by growing comfort. "Your ranch," Delilah ventured during a lull. "Is it far from town?" "About 5 miles west," Kane replied. "Not far. I'd like to see it someday." The words slipped out before Delilah could consider their propriety. Kane's expression softened. "I'd like that too." He hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. "In fact, I was hoping you might agree to ride out there tomorrow. For dinner. If Miss Emmeline wouldn't object to chaperoning, of course." Joy bubbled up inside Delilah, unexpected and overwhelming. "I'm sure she wouldn't. Object, that is." She met his gaze directly. "I'd be honored to see your home, Kane." Something in his expression shifted at her use of his given name, a relaxing of barriers long maintained. "Good," he said simply. But the single word contained multitudes. The remainder of the celebration passed in a pleasant blur for Delilah. She and Kane rejoined the festivities, participating in games, sharing meals with townspeople eager to know them both better, and occasionally exchanging glances that spoke of possibilities neither was yet ready to voice aloud. As twilight descended and lanterns were lit around the square, Kane walked Delilah and Emmeline home, the three of them discussing the day's events with easy camaraderie. At Emmeline's door, Kane confirmed arrangements for the following day's visit to his ranch, his formal words belied by the warmth in his eyes as they rested on Delilah. "Until tomorrow, then," he said, hat in hand. "Until tomorrow," Delilah echoed, her heart full of anticipation. As Kane rode away into the gathering darkness, Emmeline linked her arm through Delilah's. "Well, cousin," she said with gentle amusement, "it seems Sonora will be even more of a home to you than I anticipated." Delilah blushed but didn't contradict her. The future that had seemed so uncertain in the wilderness now stretched before her, bright with promise and possibility. And at its center stood a quiet, honorable man who had tracked her across dangerous territory to bring her home only to find, perhaps, that she might become his home as well. The following afternoon found Delilah and Emmeline in a buggy borrowed from a neighbor, following Kane's directions to the Kirkland ranch. As they crested a gentle rise, the property came into view, a sprawling main house of limestone and timber, several outbuildings, corrals containing horses, and beyond them, the rolling pastureland where cattle grazed in the distance. "It's beautiful," Delilah breathed, taking in the evident care and prosperity of the place. "The Kirkland spread is one of the finest in the county," Emmeline confirmed. "Kane's father built it from nothing, and Kane has only improved it since taking over." She glanced at Delilah with a knowing smile. "A woman could do far worse." "Emmeline," Delilah protested, though her blush betrayed her. Her cousin laughed. "Don't play coy with me, Delilah Thorne. I've seen how you look at him and how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." Before Delilah could formulate a response, Kane emerged from the main house, striding toward them with a warm smile that transformed his usually serious features. He helped them down from the buggy with courteous efficiency, his hand lingering on Delilah's perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Welcome to Kirkland Ranch," he said, a note of pride evident in his voice. The afternoon unfolded like a dream for Delilah. Kane showed them the property, from the comfortable main house with its surprisingly well-stocked library to the barns where his prized breeding stock was housed. He introduced them to his foreman, a grizzled older man named Hank who'd worked for the Kirkland family since Kane was a boy, and to several other ranch hands who clearly respected their employer. "Kane's the fairest boss in 3 counties," one young cowboy told Delilah confidentially as she admired the horses. "Treats his men like family." Throughout the tour, Delilah found herself increasingly drawn to Kane, not just his physical presence, imposing though it was, but the evident care he took with his land and animals, the respect he commanded without demanding it, the occasional flashes of dry humor that revealed depths beyond the stoic exterior. Dinner, served on the wide porch overlooking the ranch, was a surprisingly elegant affair. Kane had clearly gone to considerable effort, with a tablecloth Delilah suspected was rarely used and his mother's china brought out for the occasion. "I hope you'll forgive the simple fare," he apologized as he served a hearty beef roast with vegetables from his kitchen garden. "My cooking skills are limited." "It's wonderful," Delilah assured him sincerely. And it was not just the food, but the entire experience of being welcomed into his home, seeing the life he'd built, understanding more fully the man who had risked so much to save her. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber hues reminiscent of their first view of Texas together, Emmeline made a tactical retreat, announcing her intention to examine Kane's flower gardens more closely. "Don't mind me," she said with transparent innocence. "I'll just be over here among the roses for, half an hour or so." Left alone on the porch, Delilah and Kane shared a moment of amused understanding at Emmeline's matchmaking efforts. Then Kane's expression grew more serious. "I've been meaning to speak with you," he began, his deep voice carrying a note of uncertainty unusual for him. "About what happens next?" Delilah's heart quickened. "Next?" Kane nodded, his gaze steady on her face. "I brought you to Sonora because it was right, because you needed to reach your family. But since then, I've found myself thinking of you for other reasons." "What reasons?" Delilah asked softly, though she hoped she knew the answer. Kane hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. "When I tracked you through Indian territory, I was following a stranger. But the woman I found, her courage, her determination, her spirit, she wasn't a stranger for long." He took a deep breath. "I know it's sudden. We've known each other barely 2 weeks. But I feel as though I've known you much longer." "Yes," Delilah agreed, understanding exactly what he meant. "Our circumstances, they compressed time somehow, made us see each other more clearly than perhaps we might have otherwise." Relief flickered across Kane's features at her understanding. "Exactly." He moved slightly closer, his voice dropping. "I don't want to rush you, Delilah. You've been through an ordeal. You're just settling into Sonora, but I needed you to know that I care for you, as more than someone I helped, more than a friend." Joy bloomed in Delilah's chest, warm and expansive. "I care for you too, Kane. Very much." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the plains, gradual, then suddenly brilliant. Kane reached for her hand, enfolding it in his much larger one with infinite gentleness. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." Delilah's answer was in her eyes, in the way she turned her hand to lace her fingers with his, in the smile that mirrored his own. "I'm very willing." The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Delilah's life. As summer ripened toward autumn, she settled into her role as Sonora's newest teacher, preparing the schoolhouse for the coming term with Emmeline's guidance. The community embraced her fully, her ordeal in Indian territory becoming less a defining tragedy and more a testament to her resilience. And through it all, Kane was a constant presence. He called at Emmeline's house regularly, escorted Delilah to church on Sundays, and invited both women to the ranch for dinner at least weekly. Their courtship unfolded with a comfortable inevitability, as though they were continuing a journey begun in the wilderness, rather than starting something new. By the time school commenced in September, no one in Sonora was surprised to see Kane Kirkland waiting outside the schoolhouse each afternoon to walk Miss Thorne home, or to find them deep in conversation on Emmeline's porch swing as twilight gathered. The first frost of autumn had just touched the countryside when Kane invited Delilah for a special dinner at the ranch, mentioning casually that Hank and his wife would be present as chaperones rather than Emmeline. The change from their established pattern sent a thrill of anticipation through Delilah, who suspected this evening might prove significant. She wore her best dress for the occasion, a deep green that complemented her auburn hair, now fully restored to its former glory after the trials of her abandonment. Kane met her at Emmeline's door with uncharacteristic nervousness evident in his manner, though he looked handsome as ever in clean denims and a pressed white shirt. The ride to the ranch passed in comfortable conversation about the school term, the upcoming harvest festival, and Kane's recent cattle sale. Yet beneath the ordinary topics ran an undercurrent of expectation that both acknowledged without directly addressing. At the ranch, Hank and his wife Martha greeted them warmly before tactfully retreating to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Kane led Delilah not to the porch where they usually dined, but to a small sitting room she hadn't seen on previous visits. A fire burned cheerfully in the grate, taking the edge off the autumn chill, and the furniture had been arranged to create an intimate setting. "This was my mother's favorite room," Kane explained as Delilah admired the comfortable space. "She called it her sanctuary." "It's lovely," Delilah said sincerely, noting the feminine touches that remained handmade quilts, carefully arranged wildflowers, books of poetry on a small shelf. "I haven't used it much since she passed," Kane admitted. "It didn't feel right somehow. But lately, I've been thinking it shouldn't remain empty, that she would have wanted it enjoyed." He hesitated, then added quietly that she would have wanted you to feel welcome here. The simple statement carried such weight that Delilah's breath caught. She turned to find Kane watching her with an expression of such tender vulnerability that it nearly undid her composure. "Kane," she began, but he gently interrupted. "I had a speech prepared," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Practiced it for days, actually. But now that you're here, the words seem inadequate." Delilah's heart raced as Kane moved closer, taking both her hands in his. "When I found you in Indian territory, I thought I was completing a mission, bringing you to safety, doing what was right." His voice deepened with emotion. "I didn't expect to find myself in the process. Didn't expect that in saving you, I'd discover what was missing in my own life." Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes as Kane continued, his usual reserve completely gone, replaced by raw honesty. "I love you, Delilah Thorne. I think I began loving you when I saw your footprints in the dust, continuing on despite impossible odds, and every day since has only confirmed what my heart already knew." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I know our courtship has been brief by conventional standards, but there's nothing conventional about how we found each other." When he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds, Delilah's tears spilled over. "It was my grandmother's," Kane explained softly. "My mother always said it should go to the woman who completed our family circle." He sank to one knee, still holding her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "Delilah Thorne, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of making this house a home again? Of building a life with me here in Sonora?" Through her tears, Delilah smiled with a joy so complete it bordered on pain. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Kane, I will marry you." With hands that trembled slightly, Kane slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her into a gentle embrace. When his lips found hers in a first, tender kiss, Delilah felt as though everything in her life, even the terrible ordeal of her abandonment, had been leading to this moment, this man, this future they would build together. They were married in Sonora's white-steepled church on a crisp November morning, with Emmeline standing as Delilah's attendant and Hank serving as Kane's best man. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the church overflowing with well-wishers drawn by the romantic tale of the abandoned teacher and the rancher who had tracked her through Indian territory. Sheriff Miller gave the bride away, a role he accepted with gruff emotion when Delilah asked him. "Never thought I'd be standing in for a father," he admitted as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "It's an honor, Miss Thorne." "It's fitting," Delilah replied softly. Without you sending Kane after me, there would be no wedding today." As she walked down the aisle toward Kane, resplendent in a new suit ordered specially from San Antonio, Delilah felt the completion of a journey far more significant than the physical distance from Indian Territory to Sonora. From desperation to hope, from abandonment to belonging, from solitude to love, each step had led her here, to this man who had risked everything to find a woman he didn't know. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, exchanged in voices steady with certainty. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the congregation seemed to lift the very rafters of the church. The celebration continued at the Kirkland ranch, transformed for the occasion with bunting, flowers, and tables laden with food prepared by the women of Sonora. As afternoon stretched into evening, guests danced in the yard to fiddle music. Children played tag between the outbuildings, and the newlyweds received congratulations from what seemed like every resident of the county. As twilight gathered, Kane found Delilah standing alone on the porch, taking a moment's respite from the festivities. He slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "Happy Mrs. Kirkland," he murmured, the new name still sounding wondrous to both of them. "Beyond words," Delilah replied, leaning into his embrace. She gestured toward the gathering where Emmeline was dancing with the blacksmith's son, where Sheriff Miller was deep in conversation with Martha, where children chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I never imagined finding such happiness, such belonging when I set out for Sonora." "Nor I," Kane admitted. "I thought my life was settled, the ranch, the work, occasional visits to town. I never expected." He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words to express the transformation she had brought to his existence. Delilah understood without explanation. Rising on tiptoe, she kissed him softly, unconcerned with the approval or disapproval of their guests. "Sometimes the journey we think we're taking isn't the one we need," she said when they parted. Kane's smile held all the warmth and promise of their shared future. "And sometimes getting lost is the only way to be found." As darkness fell completely, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a golden glow over the celebration. Delilah and Kane moved among their guests, accepting well wishes and sharing their joy, both aware that this night marked not an ending but a beginning of their marriage, of their life together, of a story that had started in desperation but would continue in love. Later, much later, when the last guest had departed and they stood alone in the house that was now truly their home, Kane drew Delilah into his arms with reverent tenderness. "Welcome home," he whispered against her hair. And Delilah, who had once feared she would die alone in Indian Territory, felt the perfect rightness of his words. She was home not just in Sonora, not just at the Kirkland ranch, but in the arms of the man who had tracked her for weeks to bring her to safety, only to discover that in saving her he had found his own salvation. "Home," she echoed, raising her face to his. "At last." Years later, on summer evenings when the Texas sky blazed with stars, Kane and Delilah would often sit on their porch swing, watching their children play in the yard, two sons with their father's quiet strength, a daughter with her mother's determination. Sometimes they would tell the story of how they met, carefully edited for young ears, explaining how Mama had been lost and Papa had found her. "Like a hero in a storybook," their daughter would say dreamily. "Like a Texas Ranger," the older boy would correct with authority. "Like Papa," the youngest would conclude simply. And Kane and Delilah would exchange glances over their children's heads, remembering the desperate days in Indian Territory, the tracking, the rescue, the journey home that had become the beginning of their journey together. Those memories, once fraught with fear and uncertainty, had been transformed by time and love into the foundation of their shared life, a life neither had imagined possible before fate and courage brought them together under the vast western sky.